Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't pull it out of thin air. I just got, I got a text and had a conversation with somebody that I trust that basically said, these not saying that it was definitely going to happen, but that Minnesota and Cleveland had conversations about Odell and was told about what Minnesota would be giving up in order to make that trade with Cleveland, which would be a 2 and a 5 next year. So I mean, it's fascinating to see if it does happen. I asked, is it definitely going to happen? I wouldn't say that. We'll see what happens. Anything, but I'm just telling you that the two teams have had conversations.
So just as I'm sitting down here and I'm getting settled and I'm getting my mind in the right place for a big day of reckless speculation with my friend and our journeyman correspondent, Sage Rosenfels. And I'm just getting ready here. I'm like putting my headphones on. I'm sitting down and then I see just the best tweet from someone about Odell Beckham coming to Minnesota. And until I say it, I can't move on with this. This is from Taylor on Twitter. Someone tell Odell Beckham the Vikings have great boat parties. It's just too good. It's just perfect.
The famous yes, for both teams very famous boat parties.
Yes. That's
and
why it's so
things
perfect.
didn't go well afterwards. I think both situations the coach got fired actually.
Yeah, that's
in the
right.
Giants case, they didn't win a game after the boat, I think was what happened there. So.
Yeah, they had the boat party. They all took pictures on the boat, and then they came back and completely no-showed and lost in the playoffs. And yeah, well, so that's all right. That's how I want to start it for sure. So we have this rumor, and the guy from WFAN who calls himself Moose, who was just on, which is great. And I think we have failed ourselves by not having a nickname for all of us like Moose. But and I can get behind that. That's a fullback nickname. But tell me what you think, Sage.
You can get behind it because it's a fullback nickname.
It sure is. I tell me what you think. There's the rumor from the WFAN talk show host that the Vikings and Browns have had discussions for Odell Beckham Jr. pertaining to a second and fifth round pick, not this year, but next year, which is kind of odd. And here we are with the most reckless of all reckless speculation. So give me your reaction.
Well, the Vikings need a number one wide receiver, another one, opposite Thielen. So there it makes sense. A second or fifth rounder, I think is a pretty dang good deal for a guy who's, I think, worth at least a first rounder. As far as compensation, he's that type of talent. The salary cap thing makes no sense at all.
Right.
That's where it doesn't make any sense. It's pretty much, okay, let's get this one guy, and we've got nothing left. Which means also not have a free safety probably either, because they'll have to figure out something with him in some sort of trade. So that's where it doesn't make sense at all. And trades have to make sense, but both with the compensation as far as draft picks or whatever it might be, but also the salary cap, and that's where I just don't see this as a possibility.
So Odell Beckham,
and to be honest with you, yes, the Vikings badly need them one wide receiver. Yes, he's very talented, but there's something about Odell Beckham that I feel like can hurt a football team. The sort of the locker room thing. And I think it's sometimes when you have guys who truly believe, and they are like world superstars, but sort of get what feels like to me almost lost in that superstardom. It didn't do well for him in New York, and it didn't do well for him. He was better in Cleveland last year, but I'm sure he hates being in Cleveland, not being a big market, and so from that aspect, I don't know if I'd like him on the football team either.
So just from the cap perspective, Odell Beckham has a cap number of $14.25 million for this year. So if you were to trade away Anthony Harris, you could fit Odell Beckham into it. And one positive part of his salary cap situation is that after the 2020 season, you can cut him and have no dead cap money. So it's basically a 1-year deal, and then you can just move on if it doesn't work out, or if it does work out, you could just keep him on a $15 million a year salary cap number for the following 3 years. So actually that would become, if you liked how it was going, that would become kind of a good contract once they go to 17 games. And then all of a sudden, he's not at that point one of the highest paid receivers, though, likely if he's got good seasons, he's going to want a different contract.
Well, I don't like trading player. I don't like trading second round draft. Imagine this. Imagine they trade for him. They do. He does play. It ends up being basically a 1-year deal, and then the following spring, he's not on the team anymore, and you don't have your second, fifth round draft picks.
Right.
I think that would be like, this is annoying. We need those draft picks. So I don't like trading draft picks for a guy, and you see it occasionally on teams that are maybe going to make a run. And like another team has a player who's in the last year of his contract, they don't see him resigning, and they'll trade for him for basically like the run at the end of that season.
Yep.
And I don't think the Vikings are in that type of scenario to trade an important draft pick, second rounder, for somebody for just 1 year. I don't think this is the type of team or situation to make that type of trade.
There's a little bit too with Odell Beckham of name recognition versus how good he has actually been recently. And 2 of the last 3 years, he's had some sort of injury thing. The year in between, he was very good, but had meltdowns that included him fighting against a kicking net at one point. And then his first introduction to his new head coach in Cleveland was him getting in trouble for handing out cash on the field to LSU players and slapping the rear end of a police officer in the LSU locker room after the game. Now, so this is very different. And this is actually a point that I made a bunch of times during the Stefon Diggs drama, is that there are many shades of gray when it comes to someone being a diva. And there is a diva like Stefon Diggs who I think desperately wanted to win and be the reason that they won and wanted the football. And it's sort of like competitively driven as his divaness, if you will. Odell Beckham just has problems controlling himself. Like
there's odd behavior.
Yeah.
Right. There's on top of there's just straight up odd. The thing which is paying the guys on the field is the classic, somebody else accomplished something. So I'm going to come in here and make it about me.
Yes. Yep.
Because I don't even know who the player was. I have no idea who that LSU player or players were that he was giving money to on the field after they won the national championship. But I do know this. That's where all the cameras were. And Odell did whatever he could to be right in front of them and then do something ridiculous. And that's Odell Beckham. And that's why I never liked really having those guys on my football team. And rarely did. Was very lucky I didn't. And the great wide receiver I did play with, Andre Johnson, that'd be the last thing that he would do. He'd be the guy that would take one of those college guys and mentor him in off-season training and show him this. If you want to become an NFL wide receiver, this is what you do, not give him a whole bunch of cash on the field.
Side note, I've been watching some Andre Johnson in old games. What a freaking monster. But that's for another day, where we should do a full film breakdown of why Andre Johnson should be in the Hall of Fame. But Odell Beckham last year, in terms of where Pro Football Focus rated him, was the 33rd best wide receiver, just ahead of Robbie Anderson and just behind DK Metcalf. And yeah, you could definitely say that their head coach didn't know what he was doing and proved it from start to finish with the Cleveland Browns, or that Baker Mayfield struggled. But here's another observation that I have from looking through his advanced statistics, is the quarterback rating when throwing to Odell Beckham has literally gone down every single year of his career in the NFL. So I don't know if even at 27, I look at him as somebody who would be an ascending player, or even a player in his prime with the injuries that he had. Remember, Baker Mayfield called out their training staff, which again goes under the category of things I've never seen before or that are super bizarre to hear a quarterback call out a training staff. But about Odell Beckham's injury and handling it wrong. And 2 years ago, he missed almost the entire season with an injury. And you've got to wonder if these things have sort of caught up to him he comes onto the scene, is so great. First 3 seasons, 91, 96, and 105 catches. Since then, 25 with the injury, 77 and 74, which is pretty pedestrian. And
74 in 16 games.
Right, play the whole season.
He hit 77 last year in 12. 91 catches his rookie year in 12 games. I mean, that's
special.
Impressive.
Yeah.
That's on pace for 120. That's right around leading the league probably at that point. If not, you are easily leading the league. So he was so impressive young.
But how about this?
And has just been, as you said, 74 catches in 16 games for a starting wide receiver with a good quarterback. That is very pedestrian.
Right. 1,035 yards, 4 touchdowns. I mean, nothing about that screams, let me make sure I get this guy in here right away. So his first season in the NFL, Eli Manning had 127.6 quarterback rating when throwing to Odell Beckham. I mean, just an absolute dynamo comes into the league like that. Last year, 70.5 rating when throwing to him. They forced him the ball a lot. He had 7 drops, which is kind of a lot for a receiver of his ilk. 7 interceptions when throwing his way, only 4 touchdowns. I mean, it's just very
How
hard.
about only 4 touchdowns last year, 16 games as starter.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people think he's a top 5 wide receiver in the league, and he has 4 touchdown catches. That's not very good. That's not very good at all.
No, I mean, if you have to go all the way back to 2016 where someone was really impressive, that's kind of hard for me to say. That's definitely someone you want on your team who also carries all this other baggage. And I do think that he could be problematic inside of their locker room, or a distraction, or be on a boat doing something he shouldn't be doing. Like, he has all these possibilities. With someone like Stephon Diggs, you worried that he wasn't happy. And when he skipped practice, it was unacceptable and they fined him for it. But when you looked at all the other stuff in terms of the off the field, the community, the locker room, everything else, I mean, Delvin Cook said it hurt to see Stephon Diggs leave. And then Kirk Cousins is on his Zoom call with the media saying Diggs is the best receiver I've ever played with. And, he's going to miss him. So it's a little bit different, I think, with Odell Beckham here. And, if you're talking about somebody who would be going on their 3rd team in 3 years, that is like the red flag of all red flags, that Cleveland celebrated a championship when they traded for him, and then a year later wants to get the hell away from him. I mean, that's not really somebody that I'm saying, oh, yes, bring him right here to me.
By the way, I felt during that Cleveland trade, is when they made that trade, it was like Cleveland not understanding you're trading for a player that is obsessed with attention. He's currently in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I think his greater goal is probably like bigger than football, as far as being a sort of a football player, but also just straight up celebrity. And that's just, he's going to Cleveland. He's not going to be super thrilled about that.
Right.
Like, there's just certain athletes that are looking for that type of stardom. Maybe was Dwight Howard sort of like that in the NBA career. He wanted to go to a major, city or whatever. And you'd think something like the Chargers or the Rams, or obviously the Bears is a huge market. That Dallas Cowboys, one of those style football teams, I feel like Odell Beckham would fit better in, because he loves that stardom, he loves that camera. And I always wondered, and I feel like with Odell, for me, I sort of saw that early. Like, that's who he wants to be. That's important to him. And the first thing I always think of is what happens to those guys when their careers are done, because they will be at some point, whether it's in 3 years or whether it's in 12 years. Players, just their career ends. And so what happens when you're so used to getting that attention, wanting that attention, needing that attention, and it just will go away. Even if you can be on TV and be like Michael Irvin and work for NFL Network and get some of it, it's just not going to be the same as when you're playing. And I don't know if they, figure out if it's hard for them when they're done, because they're craving that attention. They're so used to getting it. And all of a sudden, people just don't care as much. Like, you're the guy who used to play. And it just sort of dwindles down, like Chad Johnson or, those types of guys. What happens to those guys when they're done? I imagine that to struggle. And I imagine at some point they hopefully figured out all that, all that attention seeking stuff is fleeting, especially if you're an athlete, because it's not like you're a musician who you can sort of do it for, until you're 75 years old or whatever.
Right.
Athletes can't. And when I saw Odell Beckham Jr. young and maybe not his first year, but after you got into that second, third season, I thought to myself, man, this guy, when he's done playing, he might struggle with the lack of attention.
Yeah, and he's sort of struggled with it even just being in Cleveland since then, clearly from what we saw with what happened in LSU. And I just don't really think that he and that sort of mentality would fit with a lot of the other players that are the stars on the Vikings roster right now. Dalvin Cook is a very understated type of person. I mean, he was somebody that came out with, quote, character issues, and he sat next to Teddy Bridgewater for an entire year and has been, the perfect choir boy since he's been a Minnesota Viking, but he's also not a guy who seeks attention for himself and tries to put himself out there. He's the one that's, goes ahead and thanks the offensive line first. He's like that kind of guy. And Adam Thielen is not an attention seeker. You don't have that from Danielle Hunter, from Harrison Smith. I mean, most of the guys, Eric Hendricks, most of them who are the big time players and leaders in this locker room are the understated guys who shy away from cameras, shy away from attention. I mean, what offseason stories have you heard this year about Harrison Smith other than us being mad he didn't make the all-pro team for the all-decade team? Like, you'll never hear that from a lot of these guys in this locker room. And it just seems like it would be a very, very weird fit to have someone that wants to be the star of the show.
Yeah, correct. And I don't see that fit either. And the person I think he fits the least with, and he might be the easiest guy to get along with, is Gary Kubiak. Kubiak is not that type of guy.
Yeah.
He doesn't really like those types of guys. He doesn't like prima donnas. He likes receivers that listen, if we're going to throw you the ball, you got to do us a favor. You got to get in the block. And he asks receivers consistently to dig out the safeties, to be a part of that running game, to be really good blockers. Again, Andre's one of those guys that was a very, very good physical blocker. He doesn't like the prima donna types, the diva types. He likes sort of blue collar. You go back to the old Broncos when he was coming up, Rod Smith and McCaffrey.
Yeah.
Those guys weren't divas by any means. Those guys were workers. And so I don't see it. And not that Coobs can't work with one of those types of guys. He also Coobs can work with anybody, but he prefers to not have those types of guys, because I think over the long haul, over the marathon of a season or seasons, those types of personalities can wear on coaches, on players, on everybody. And I think he's seen over his long coaching career that those situations just generally don't work out very well.